Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Whither the Looniversity, the podcast of the Peerless Review. I'm excited to have my guest on today, who's been in the news quite a bit recently. My guest is Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, professor of anthropology at San Jose State University. Her area of expertise is physical anthropology, where she does skeletal analyses to understand bone biology. She is the author of dozens of peer-reviewed publications in top-tier journals in her field. And she's author of a number of books, including the most recent one, 2020's Repatriation and Erasing the Past, which was sort of the origins of some of the more recent controversies she's been embroiled in. That book criticizes repatriation laws that require excavated human remains, skeletal remains, to be returned to ancestral homelands. Dr. Weiss's argument is that museums and laboratories play a critical role in preserving those materials and really preserving the record of human heritage. Um, Elizabeth, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I ask everybody this. Tell us how you got into anthropology. Why anthropology? When anthropology?
Well, I didn't actually declare as a major anthropology until I believe my second year as an undergraduate. But one of the reasons why I love anthropology and what attracted me even very, very young on, before I even knew the word anthropology, was anatomy. And I loved anatomy toys like the Visible Woman, where you put all the pieces together, skeletal anatomy. And so initially, when I went into the university system, I thought I would go pre-med, but I realized that what my real interest and love was understanding the anatomy of the past to help reconstruct what past lives were like. So not only looking at skeletal anatomy to understand, for example, bone biology, which I do a lot of, but also to understand what people were doing in the past, what they died of in the past. And it's just a fascinating field. Um, I I still am in awe every time I open up a box of human remains. And it's just my love of understanding that past through looking at bones has not diminished at all.
Interesting. And so you found a way to kind of fuse an anatomical interest that's more related to kind of biology with this sort of historical archaeological emphasis. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. So, uh, probably many of our viewers are aware of the incident that happened in early October, which made me really want to have you on. What happened, to recount it briefly, is that you were doing some research in your curation room at the university. And you took a picture, or someone took a picture of you holding a skull of an indigenous person from, I don't know when, many centuries ago. And you were smiling, and I think that the quote, the caption that you had on the image was, "So happy to be back with some old friends," referring to happy to be back in the laboratory, doing the work that you do with these artifacts that are a part of our collective human heritage. The response to that was pretty sharp and pretty quick. And Obviously, people thought that this was in rather poor taste, some of the woke people. You responded, to your credit, by, in my opinion, the best way to respond to woke insanity is to treat them dismissively. And you said that this is a woke activist mob without any legitimate arguments. And I would like you to fill us in on this most recent kerfuffle, I guess, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ways that maybe your book sort of teed this up.
Okay. So basically, um, it it revolves around two tweets, I would say.
Okay.
The first one was actually about a month earlier, and it was on my op-ed from the Mercury News, where I write about, sorry, I'm gonna say, it was the op-ed on the Mercury News was maybe a month later,
Okay.
within a month, um, and basically the op-ed was criticizing the new California NAGPRA laws, Cal NAGPRA, and that got a huge amount of negative attention on Twitter and other social media sites, um, calling me everything from a ghoul to a grave digging digger, to the um, racist, anti-indigenous, and so forth. The photo was actually put up earlier, but then they backtracked and looked at that photo in relation
Mm.
to the op-ed. I believe that they basically thought, oh, we have to find more dirt, kind of,
So they
right?
went digging.
And they went digging. Um,
A little
and
excavation of their own.
yes, and so this photo was taken in the curation facility. I was reboxing some materials, um, just keeping up curation, you know, of the collection. And I had been gone from the collection for, I think, 17 months because of COVID. I mean,
Mhm.
our school shut down pretty much. And so I was really happy to be back. And I, was looking through and doing my work, and I saw the skull, and I thought, wow, how great it is to be back. I took a photo, and I basically posted it as a sincere statement. Um, People, oh my goodness, how can you call these old friends? And we use the term friends in a variety of ways. I don't think anybody who really looks at that statement could think that I'm doing it uh, disrespectfully, if you're being um, unbiased, right? If you're taking a neutral point. We have friends of the library, friends of the forest, right? Um, so I think that the term friends is always considered a positive, and I didn't think of any that that there was anything wrong with using that term, and I still don't think there's anything wrong with using the term. I think anybody who reads something malicious into that is incorrect. um, and so then they were like, oh, well, she's not holding gloves. Well, there's a lot of debate about when to where she's not wearing gloves, excuse me, when and where to wear gloves in bioarchaeology. And bioarchaeology is the study of skeletal remains from the archaeological record. If I was looking at a crime scene in forensics, of course you would wear gloves. But these skeletal remains, which were initially excavated in the 1960s, have been handled without gloves for decades. Decades even before I had ever seen them, right? So it's not like, I'm ruining some data. Um, Actually, the National Park Service's recommendation for handling skeletal remains is to not wear gloves
Hmm.
in most cases because you're more likely to drop things with gloves on.
Huh.
So in a sense, this was a false straw man argument about, oh, I'm not handling the remains correctly. My provost incorrectly then pointed out that how bad it was that I wasn't wearing gloves, which is it's just a complete non-issue.
What is your
Um,
provost discipline before he entered administration?
I I
Not
think it's
anthropology?
I think it's geography if I'm not wrong.
Mm.
So, um, but so that and I responded to him. I actually reached out to him privately first, and he basically did not want to meet with me. um, but I always feel like the best attitude is to just respond honestly and try to be sincere and civil. Um, and so that was my tactic. I did write a response to that. What ended up happening was, as a result of this reaction to the photo, is that the university basically locked me out of the curation facility. I've
Wow.
never seen um, university facilities office work so fast to change the locks. It's like, they changed the locks.
Well,
And
I have the quotes from your provost here and states that were made to the university community. He said that the image, quote, evoked shock and disgust, and quote, that it does not align with the school's academic values. He did, as far as I could tell, he didn't really elaborate what those values are. I think it's kind of sweet that universities still have values, but uh yeah, it sounds like he was definitely not interested in having a dialogue.
And ironically, prior to this, the university would oftentimes ask me for promotional materials with me with bones. So they would sometimes send out university photographers for me to take pictures with skeletal remains. So this was a common thing that was done over the years. So it's not like, oh, she's never done this before. And I'll get to that kind of argument in a little bit. But basically, um, one of the things is that they locked me out of the curation facility,
Did they just like
and
change the code on it for you,
yeah, they
or
changed the locks. Yeah, they literally rekeyed it,
w-
and they basically then had a new set of protocols that were put in place to handle the remains or to get access to the remains, and it read like a checklist of everything I hate. um, and I think my favorite one, being sarcastic here, but my favorite one was that menstruating personnel were not allowed to handle remains. And
what?
this is one thing is the fact that they didn't even use the term woman is,
Right, right.
personnel. But the other thing is
So is
that
this,
this
are
was,
the other women in your department going to self-report on that, or how's that going to work?
I suspect so. So there is a NAGPRA coordinator and a tribal liaison, and they are both females. And so when this happened, I, my lawyers and I, we looked at this and I said, this is a Title IX violation.
It
you know,
is.
and it's just ridiculous. Um,
Incidentally, that strikes me as inherently discriminatory. It's
yeah.
exactly the kind of thing that Title IX violations get filed for all the time.
And so we actually had that stricken off. We contacted when we made our filing, we mentioned that. And it was taken off. But I mean, it was only taken off because I mentioned it. And it's this kind of you know, although you can argue that the university has to follow the law when it comes to repatriation laws. And I have never broken repatriation laws. I I am against repatriation, but I do my job. So I've never like prevented Native Americans from filing for them. I've helped the NAGPRA coordinator repatriate some skeletons. So I've never broken the law. I don't think that that means that you can't say that you're against it. I mean,
Right.
that's a different story. Um,
So, can we back up a second here and
mhm.
explain to sort of people who might not be in the know like me exactly what do these new laws in California say? What are the obligations of researchers as it relates to these?
Okay, so I'll start with the federal one and then say how California like modified it because that's probably the easiest way to understand it.
Okay.
So the federal law is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, and it basically states that skeletal remains, human remains, and sacred objects, um, like associated funerary objects, grave goods, um, that are in the hands or are being curated by federally funded organizations are are susceptible to being repatriated or given back to the tribes that are culturally affiliated with the remains, with the collections, and that the affiliation can be determined with biology, like DNA.
Hmm.
with skeletal studies like craniometry, right? Study of skulls,
What
of
about
crania.
just informal genealogy, like if
Yeah.
sort of lore
And
holds?
also, yeah, and it also takes into play, it also takes into account the Native American histories and their oral tradition.
Okay.
I would say that they take that too much into account, but it's supposed to be a balance. It's supposed to be a compromise, and so it's not supposed to deal with anything that's not sacred or not human remains, and it's not supposed to deal with things that like animal remains that are not buried with as grave goods, things like there's a lot of things at sites that are not sacred, right? The definition of sacred is basically that it would be required in the traditional Indian religion for their religious practices, which is a little tricky since they didn't write them down.
And
But
most of those
nevertheless,
religious practices from centuries ago are probably forgotten now
right.
completely.
And they weren't written down. So,
Right.
um, so what we basically, CalNAGPRA took it one step further, and I say CalNAGPRA, California's NAGPRA, is like NAGPRA on steroids, because basically what they said is if there's any ambiguity um, or disagreement, that the Native Americans' voice or decision supersedes the scientific one. So if we have a collection of skeletal remains, and I say, well, they don't
Sacred.
belong to this tribe. And the Native Americans of that tribe says, oh, yes, they do, because our oral history. And even if I would say, well, actually the DNA shows that it doesn't, the tribe story supersedes the DNA, right? Um, so basically, um, the that's a law, right? But the law does not count, like things that are like uh, records that are already done, like collected, um, data that is already collected, photographs that are already taken, and so forth. And so, in a sense, part of the problem is that the university has decided that because the Native Americans have said that they want everything, and they do plan to burn all photos, all X-rays, all
Oh wow.
records, um, and I would say that this is a aberration of the university's duty to just go along with it, because that's not what the law says. And it's actually interesting that everything I've asked for turns out to be sacred. So initially, the Native American tribes had that they wanted to repatriate the remains, and I would argue that these remains, which are thousands of years old, the oldest ones being 3,500, are not affiliated with the tribes who are asking for them. They were initially signed as unaffiliated, but we don't know which tribe they came from. And actually, it's multiple. I've looked at the collection, and it's a specific collection that we house. And I've looked at their crania, and um, basically saw that there are changes in that collection because it spans 2,000 years. It's all pre-contact, and it spans 2,000 years,
So there
but
were
it doesn't
probably
look,
different tribes in that space
yeah,
at the same
they're
time.
invasions, right?
Mm.
And there's lots of evidence of violence. There's like obsidian flakes in the vertebrae and so forth. So I would argue that it's not affiliated to the modern tribe. But regardless of whether that argument holds or not, I would still say that planning on burning the X-rays is not in the law, you know? So I think that um, that's the nuance.
So let
But
me ask you just a little more because I'm curious. So basically, does it work like if a Native American tribe makes the request, right? They have to make the request, I would presume. And
Yes.
then the sort of analysis of the claim is done. And then let's say that they decide, all right, this is a legitimate claim. These remains need to be, or objects need to be repatriated. How are those objects and remains transferred to the tribe, and who within the tribe is qualified to take possession of these things? Do you know?
Well, usually there's like a elder or a chief, right, or a committee of them that will take them, and there'll be like a group that are their repatriation committee or
Okay.
so. Um,
And are the remains reburied at that point?
they're reburied. Yes, they're
Okay.
basically reburied, and one of the issues sometimes is that remains are not reburied for decades because they don't have the land that they want to rebury them on.
Ah.
And
So
so,
they end up in a room very much like the one that they're currently sitting in, but with less of the precautionary measures that the university's put in place.
or they may even sit in the same room, but nobody can access them.
Ah.
So I could work at the university for another 20 years, for example, and it could be that those remains are never repatriated because the Native Americans of the Bay Area want land of the Bay Area to repatriate them, and it might be that they never get repatriated in my time,
Hmm.
but no one can research them, which is
Wow. And so do they seal the containers so that they cannot be opened at that point?
but no, they just lock the door,
Oh, okay.
right? Yeah,
That'll
just
work.
lock.
Um,
So, but when I first, when I first was going through this, I asked for other materials that would not be covered in NAGPRA or CalNAGPRA, like X-rays. My first real research was done on CT scans, and my PhD dissertation was done with X-rays. So this is one of my areas of expertise is radiography and looking at the bones with X-rays. And basically, I was told that these were sacred as well. How,
radiological images.
how they can be sacred, I don't understand, considering that the definition of sacred is that it has to be something that they would have needed in their traditional Indian religion to practice whatever ritual they were going to practice. So they had no X-rays. So how could this be sacred?
Right.
you know?
So it sounds
Um,
like that the game is to just sort of, and I don't suppose that every Native American tribe is doing this, but some who are motivated by activism are just trying to essentially confiscate the entire data record of.
That's what I think. And I think that sometimes it's personal. And I do think that in my case it is personal. I think that they had I not requested it, they wouldn't have. I'm not even sure they would have known that the X-rays were there. Um, had I then requested the animal remains that were not associated with burials. So like obviously some animal remains are associated with burials. I understand that and I appreciate that complexity. Um, but I asked for the ones that were basically the trash heap remains, and they won't give those to me either.
The
They claim
trash
those
heaps
are
are sacred.
trash heaps are now sacred.
Okay.
Um, so so I do think that that this is a moving goalposts issue, and I think that it can be moving goalposts in a general sense in the field. For example, now the Society for American Archaeology, um, they started off saying that they would not display any books with photos of skeletal remains at their conference. And then they've now changed it that um, all of their journals don't have photos of remains anymore. You may be allowed to submit a sketch of it.
Sketch. Okay.
It's
Um,
crazy,
all right.
So I do think that this kind of issue is it's it can be both personal like in my case, but it's not just personal, it's also a field wide problem.
I want to talk about that in just a moment, but we should give listeners an idea of maybe what the initial impetus was for this. You've done work for some time against repatriation and just sort of analyzing the questions involved there. But your most recent book, with I think your co-author's name is Springer, right?
Yes, James
Um,
Springer.
in this book, as I understand it, makes a more direct critique of the law and the sort of philosophical and scientific underpinnings of the law, such as they may be. Um, so this was, I think, the thing that got you on the radar of the kind of woke activists. There was an open letter after the publication of your book, I think, that was signed by some, I don't know, 800 students and experts in anthropology. And that's no small feat to put that together, I think. And after that, it seems to me, as an outside observer, that that was really when you kind of became a target. Is that right?
That's correct. So the book is Repatriation and Erasing the Past. It's University of Florida Press. And actually, I think, I've been writing about repatriation issues as long as I've been an anthropologist. My first article was like in 2001 or so. Um, so it my views have not been secret, um, even though my university sometimes acts like, oh, they had no idea that I held these views. I have held the same views for my entire career, and I've never made it a secret. Um, I think why this was different from my other writings was that it upset the social justice warriors of anthropology, that I got it into an academic press.
Mm,
I think that that's what upset them. That it was actually, it's difficult to get a book in academic press. It undergoes peer review, you know, and like none of the reviewers said, "Oh, well, this is a racist book," or "This is, you know, anti-indigenous." And it's not like these reviewers like, "Oh, great, check off,"
yeah, it's
fine.
hard.
They had lots of comments, and there were lots of um, things that we did to get this through, but they were not. It was that wasn't the issue about. It wasn't like, oh, it's racist or it's politically unpalatable, or it was more like, organization and things, and meshing Jim, my co-author Jim and I's style and so forth. Those were the issues. Um, and so I think it really upset them that it got into an academic press. I think that that's what really upset them.
This is a
And
way that they try to ensure that it won't happen again, is by
yes,
throwing the fit, right?
right.
And it asserts this claim that the woke faction of any discipline has this veto power to say what will and will not be allowed within the scope of the research that gets done in any given field. It's really disturbing.
And one of the things they wanted is they wanted the book to be banned. They don't use that term, but they basically wanted the publisher to withdraw the book, which is the equivalent of banning the book, and they wanted the publisher to make sure that this book was not in any libraries or open source.
Hmm.
So this is the equivalent of banning a book,
Yeah. A real banning, not taking it out of a kid's library or something like
Right.
that. Like,
And
yeah.
it's funny because in the letter they're like, they argue that it shouldn't be available with open source or in libraries. And open source, for those who don't know it, is like a way to have it for free, right?
Yeah.
Um, and nevertheless, a lot of the people who are signing this letter were asking their friends and colleagues on social media, does anybody have a free copy of this book that I could borrow?
Just in case
So
anybody who wants to ban it wanted to read it first.
yeah, I can guarantee that a lot of the people who signed that open letter and I don't know the count now, but I think it's close to 1,000.
Well,
I
look, if
keep
half of them read it, your book did really well. I
That's what
mean,
I was gonna say. It would be like a bestseller in
right.
academia if half of them read it. I don't think they did.
Mm.
I'm not saying that nobody read it of them. Some
Most of them
people did
didn't.
read it,
Most of them
but
didn't.
most of them didn't.
Mm.
And I think one of the interesting things is that there was also a whole series of book reviews, negative book reviews on it. And like some of these book reviews were written by like 5 people. What, book review by committee? So I think this is another issue. But and one of them started with like um uh, saying that my choice of cover, or, why this was such a bad choice of cover. I didn't even choose the cover, and actually we had different ideas of covers, but we were greatly limited by the fact that you can't include a skull or a photo of a bone on
Yeah.
the cover for advertising.
On my
So
2020 book, I had 0 say in the cover.
yeah,
They sent me an image and said, "What do you think of this?" And I said, "What
exactly.
if we did it in it black?" And they said, we're gonna do it like this."
Right. Yeah. And and this person who wrote this review must have known that because they are an academic themselves. So um, I just thought that that was very strange to spend like someone a part of a book review on the cover.
There used to be an old saying, I guess it's gone out of vogue now, that you can't judge a book by its cover. Uh,
Right. So that's so the book definitely put me on the radar, so to speak. It's it's actually it's an interesting book from a few perspectives. One is that I have a co-author,
mm,
and Jim Springer. He's one thing is he's probably the smartest person I know, and I'm honored that I get to work with him, write with things with him. He's also a retired attorney, and he has a PhD in anthropology. So it's you know he was an excellent co-author, and he could write about the legal aspects of repatriation laws in a way that I would not be able to. It just would be beyond my ability. And so it is also a really good review of those repatriation laws, a very thorough review. But it can include, so it's basically broken into 3 sections. The first section is like what we can learn from skeletal remains, and the second, which is I wrote most of that part. Then the second section is the legal section, and then the third section is bringing it together and why we oppose this. And
so
in gen, sorry, go
give
ahead.
me the argument, like in brief, from the anthropological rather than the legal perspective. Like, what would I mean? I think I can anticipate what the arguments would be, but I'd like for you to spell them out because you'll
Sure.
probably be more eloquent than I will in that regard.
So one of the things is that um, we recognize the vast amount of knowledge that skeletal remains hold, and that this knowledge is not specific for knowledge for just any one tribe, but rather is for all of humans. That history belongs and prehistory belongs to all of humans. So that's one aspect. But not only, for just intellectually curious, but the benefit that studying skeletal remains has on forensic anthropology. Many people don't know that forensic anthropologists are often trained initially as bioarchaeologists because of that's where they get their first experience looking at skeletal remains, and that understanding that you cannot learn about skeletal remains from just models and perfect bones, that you need to see them not well, not pristine, but literally, what breaks and what
Something that's
what a
endured
quarter
the
of a
world.
femur, yeah, what a quarter of a femur looks like, as opposed to just a whole femur, right? So that if it wasn't for anthropology, we wouldn't have bioarchaeology, we wouldn't have well-trained forensic anthropologists who do a service in helping to solve
So
crimes,
there's a
right?
whole criminological angle here that I hadn't considered. That's interesting.
Yeah. The other aspect is that physical anthropology has played a large role in medicine and helping us understand what aspects of today's diseases and ailments are new and what are ancient or have been in past populations, how those change. And that helps us understand perhaps treatment patterns, perhaps ways to prevent certain types of um, bone diseases. For example, much of my research has been on arthritis. And the patterns of arthritis are very different in prehistoric populations than in modern populations.
Hmm.
And part of this, understanding this, helps us look at, okay, well, what we know is that some of the stuff that we're doing now causes arthritis in ways that it didn't in the past. For example, our weight gain,
Yes.
right? But it's not just pure weight because the many individuals who are very overweight also have non-weight bearing arthritis and non-weight bearing joints like hand arthritis.
Hmm.
So those kinds of comparisons. And I've published in, of course, physical anthropology journals, in archaeology journals, but also in medical journals to show the links between the past and the present. So I think that as exciting as it is to understand, what Kennewick Man's last meal was, it's not just an intellectual argument, it's also practical knowledge. Um, the, the other thing is, so beyond just the knowledge, is that repatriation is really an ideology. And so one of the things we point out in repatriation and erasing the past is that it's not just about literally returning bones to tribes who think that they are related to those bones, um, but that it's become an ideology, and it's postmodern ideology that argues that the tale that is being told is only valid when it's being told by Native Americans. And therefore, we're losing the information or our ability to look at the information objectively in an objective manner. And our argument is that the skeletons are neutral, and that if you take that position, that whoever is the most uh, accurate in retelling the past is irrelevant. Their identity is irrelevant. So if I come up with, if I look at the Germanic tribe of bog bodies, and I say, well, I can tell you that they died from violence because they were against witches, and I'm wrong. Just because my mother's German doesn't mean I'm right.
Okay.
And then if a Native American looks at that bog body and says, actually, no, it's looks like they were, they died accidentally from falling in the bog, and they're right, then that's the, it doesn't matter that that person's not related to the bog bodies. And what matters is the truth, and our and we may never find the absolute truth, but we always have to strive for that truth, and that truth is not determined by the color of your skin or who you're related to. And so
So
we address that in the book as well.
let me ask you this. I mean, because this is just to you know, a, an outsider of your field. Like it seems to me, one of the big arguments would be, and I agree with you, if these remains, prehistorical remains, are the collective property of human civilization, right? Then there's something to be said that sort of the latest sort of Western Euro-American technologies have the best capacity to honor those objects by preserving them. And is that part of the argument here? Is that that perhaps experts trained in the scientific method have a better ability to preserve these objects, and so in that sense honor and revere the history that they represent?
Yeah, I would say that that's partially true. That basically the fact that universities and museums have curation facilities that help preserve the remains and have uh, the techniques to study the remains is in part, you know, um, is in part the argument. Now, nobody is saying that, oh well, if a Native American has studied anthropology, we don't want him in
Right.
the curation facility. Of course not. Our point is it's n- it's a non-issue in a
Right.
sense, or it's not it has no bearing on the truth.
It's not a matter of
So
who, it's a matter of how.
it's not a matter of who's, matter of how. A good comparison, for example, would be medicine, right? So, you know, we have Western medicine, and yet anybody can practice it.
Right.
you know? So, and I think that that's a good comparison.
And so since this book sort of you've sort of faced a sequence of trials. I think right now you have a lawsuit against your university. Tell us a little bit about this case and what you hope to gain from it.
So, when this book came out, um, my university initially were seemed supportive, but they turned they turned around. Um, and One of the things is that as the open letter against the book and was occurring, some other stuff bubbled ahead, right? One of those things that arose was that a we had a um, panel, a webinar on what makes a good Native American Studies Center at my university, and I decided to attend, and I was shocked at what I was hearing. Basically, um, the speakers who were Native American were saying things like um, there should be no office staff that are not Native American in the Native American Studies Center, um, and they said not even Hispanic, because if a Hispanic person mistakes a Native American person for Hispanic, that's an insult. And if they, you know, we wouldn't want, for example, a Mexican to say, "Oh, speak Spanish to a Cherokee," you know, and so what I said was, um, I said, why would that be an insult unless you're against Hispanics? I mean, people might look at me and say, "Oh, are you Irish?" And no, I don't have any Irish in me. I wouldn't find that insulting unless I hated the Irish. Then but I
Right.
wouldn't, right? Because there's if you truly think that all people are equal, it wouldn't be an insult. And so I brought that up, and they were very upset about it. The speakers, the provost was there, and he did not look happy. um, and then the other thing they were saying was that only Native Americans should teach Native American studies courses. They were like, we understand that this might not be possible, but only Native Americans should teach them. And and I said, why? I mean, in a sense, should only British people teach Shakespeare? And so, and I think I gave that exact argument. And I was called a racist, and I was called a Karen, and you know, all the usual,
Right. Your privilege.
insults. And I just said, I just don't see, those arguments as valid arguments. You know, and I didn't, I was respectful. I did not, this wasn't a chat. So it was like, I wasn't like being, like cussing or being
Right.
vulgar or I was just literally asking those questions. Um, I was then told my chair wanted to talk to me, and he basically told me not to go to events like that anymore. He acted like he was sympathetic, but he's like, you could really get your junior colleagues into trouble. How could I get my junior colleagues into trouble by going to these things? I don't know, but that's was part of it. Then the other aspect was right around the same time, one of my colleagues sent an email out to the listserv saying he encouraged everyone, like graduate students, to use the database site Black Authors. And I responded to that email that, and I responded very politely, said, although I believe this is well intentioned, I also think that students should cite the author who has done the best work on the issues that they're looking at, and that a person's race, ethnicity, or skin color has no actual validity, bearing on the validity of the statements of the work. And so that was called out as racist. And so these two little things arose. What happened was my chair decided that they would change the listserv from being an open listserv to closing it up so that only submissions that are okayed by him and one other faculty member would be posted. Another thing is that the chair decided to have an anti-racism speaker series to counteract the negative effects of my book. And so when he did that, I said, well, I'd like to have a speaker series on cancel culture. And
let me guess, there wasn't a speaker series on cancel culture.
He basically said, oh, we have no money. And I said, well,
he
how
didn't
about
say
next?
We have no cancel culture.
And then he said, and then I said, well, how about next semester? And he basically said no. And then what he did was he said, well, oh, by the way, I found these rules for putting on a guest speaker or for hosting a guest speaker that we should follow. And obviously, and he held a special meeting about it. And I was like, you didn't just find us rules, you were looking for an excuse not to support a speaker series from my perspective. And so that was another example. And it was interesting. He had on his anti-racism speaker series, he had a list of 4 people, but only 2 showed up. 2 canceled their appearances and 2 did their talk. And the first talk was outrageous, and it was like everything is everything is white supremacy, everything is white racism. And at that time there were a lot of attacks on Asians by Blacks, and basically I asked the question, how is that white supremacy? And he basically said, well, it's basically our fault that the Blacks feel that way.
You should have known better. If you spent more time in a humanities department, you would know where that would go.
I sincerely did not know that statement was coming.
Oh yeah.
But the second speaker, although I didn't agree with everything he said, I thought he made some good points. One point that he made, which I thought was very good, was that sometimes people who are of different ethnic groups or minority groups are pushed in to study only what is related to them. And so a Black student may not want to study African archaeology. Maybe they're interested in the Vikings, and why shouldn't they be? And so I thought that was actually a very good point. I go into these things with an open mind. And I thought one speaker was bad, and I thought one speaker was good. Why wouldn't other people feel the same way about going to a series that I give, right? Mm-hmm. But then the other thing.
Go ahead.
So the other thing was that then there was we had a whole thing about should I get access to the Carthage collection, the collection that I'm studying right now, which is Tunisian collection, and they wanted the chair wanted to first have a policy about photography before he grants me access, and we literally had a meeting where you know we in the whole department, the whole faculty met about whether I could take photos of skeletal remains. I'm the only physical anthropologist there. So we have two archaeologists who study like, artifacts like stones and pottery and so forth, right? And then we have cultural anthropologists. And so they're trying to argue that they have a right to decide whether I get to take photographs
So
of.
really, they're making a decision on your sub area of expertise.
And I fought back like heck on this one, and basically, um, just I would not give it up. And I kind of won that battle because they just basically shelved it. But that threat is still looming. And now we have two new colleagues. I don't know if that's going to become another issue. But what I think is interesting is, I mean, the one of the cultural anthropologists, one of my colleagues, um, she she said, "Well, do you have permission to take these photos from the people?" And she knew, of course, they were skeletal. And I said, well, of course not. They are dead. It's like, well, did they write anything about it? And I was like, this was in 6th century AD. They didn't have cameras. I like the absurdity of it. The
Well, that
absurdity of it.
this brings me to the more recent tempest in a teapot in your field, where some activist scholars are saying that researchers should not identify the sex of human remains because we don't know how those historical people identified in terms of the rich spectrum that is gender and sexual identity. Um,
Yeah. So one of the things is that um, there's a movement to force anthropologists looking at skeletal remains to not identify race and sex. Forensic anthropologists do this, and they do it quite well. Um, and it's an important aspect of identifying crime victims, but it bubbles into archaeology because basically, I think the end outcome is that they don't want this done on forensics, but they know that they have to, get it for archaeology as well. Otherwise, us archaeologists or bioarchaeologists will teach the forensic anthropologists how to do this, and then they'll continue doing it.
so
But one of the arguments is that this, and you'll see this in certain literature, that the the male female divide binary sex is a white colonialist system put on the to past remains, and and that
non-Western
basically,
groups.
yeah, and therefore we shouldn't determine whether these skeletal remains were male or female because we don't know. And I
Hogwash.
mean, one of the things is, yeah, it's ridiculous. One thing is, if there were so many non-binary individuals in the past, our human race would not have lasted because they wouldn't be, it's not like they would have IVF to deal with the non-pregnancies that. But the other thing is that many ethnographic studies that have many cultures where you're looking at cases of non-binary, like in East Indians, so India, they the anthropologists act like, oh, these are signs that it's accepted practice to have all these non-binary things in different cultures, but not in the Western culture. But if you actually look at um, where non-binary or where all other genders exist in different cultures, um, you see that those people are treated very badly usually, which I'm obviously not for, but it does show that they do not consider it normal, you know?
It's
Um,
an anomaly.
it's an anomaly. The other aspect of it is that if you're looking at a skeleton, you can look at it and see whether it's male or female. And
Just by
we
bone length and density and
bone
such
length,
things.
the pelvis has a slew of traits that are obviously different in males and females because of childbearing. Um, the skull has many different aspects, so you can tell if it's a male or female. You can be wrong sometimes, obviously, but we are very good at identifying sex on the skeleton. And when they've done recent studies on skeletal remains of recent people who've actually undergone sex changes, and they find that you can still tell what their biology was. So if a if a male now wants to be a female and they go through the feminization surgery, like the shaving of the Adam's apple, and you can see that those changes were made artificially and that the true biology is still there. So that doesn't change it. Um, the other aspect of this is that we're just putting our ideology on people of the past where it really doesn't belong.
In a
There's
sense,
no
that's a
evidence.
violation in itself, right?
Yeah,
That's for the people, these people pretend to be revering the past, and in fact they're rewriting it in their own image.
rewriting it. And it's actually quite ironic that this kind of woke ideology is very anti-women. So for example, if you find a skeleton with an arrowhead and it turns out to be a female skeleton, the answer is like, oh no, that was a trans male because females aren't buried with arrowheads.
Really.
Well, isn't the likely conclusion that hunting was done by both sexes?
Really, there's people who are experts in anthropology who would make that argument. Like, I know that
Yeah,
we're wow. Okay.
and there are lots of artifacts that actually are sex neutral, like sewing needles. And
Sure.
I think sewing is a good example because sewing we sometimes associate with females, right? With women, like seamstresses, but there are tailors, right?
And it's also like that's one of the sort of oldest arts that are practiced
Yeah,
by
it's not
men and women alike.
so it's not like they come to the conclusion, well, oh, the sexual division of labor is less rigid than we thought it was, which is the conclusion that I would come to. But rather, oh, well, that couldn't have been a female then, and which I just think is anti-female.
So
Um,
I've talked to other anthropologists, they have said that anthropology is one of the very rapidly wokeifying fields. And it
yeah,
sounds like what you're saying is bearing that out. Is there any way to restore it, or do you see these trends as ascendant, that a lot of people you talk to about these things will say, well, it's just a fad, this will die out and everything will go back to normal. But that's not my sense of it in the university. My sense of it is that it's consolidating power, and that it's going to be more pronounced. What say you?
I sincerely hope that it will at least retreat a little bit, ebb a little bit. I think that I'm not sure that it will. I think that um, it is our job as academics, as professors, to try to get to the truth the best we can. It is also our job not to be scared to speak about things that are politically incorrect. Um, I think that perhaps with a little luck, um, people who are speaking out against it will gain a little traction, and that it might what might happen is there might be more division. So, for example, some places that have gone very much woke early on, like Berkeley, the physical anthropologists left the cultural anthropologists. Um, but I was surprised when I gave a talk at the Society for American Archaeology how incredibly woke they were. Um, and I would not have thought so. Um, and obviously, I knew that they were not, that they were very liberal and so forth, but I didn't think that they would be, as bad as the cultural anthropologists in that sense, right? Um, I do think that physical anthropology, especially those studying bones, like myself,
Osteopathology. You've been avoiding saying it
osteopathology.
the whole time. Like you're
uh,
good. You're at recognizing that most people wouldn't know what that is.
I think that we are in a uniquely bad position because if all the remains are reburied, what is left? You know, um, and I get people sending me messages and on social media saying, "Oh, just scan them, print them out in 3D, and then return the bones." Well, a couple things is that we are not there yet with these 3D scanners. Um, in a sense, they are the details, and you have to think we're not only looking at the surface; we're looking at inside the bone and so forth. So we're
Things
not
like
there yet.
hardness, you know.
Yeah, we're not even close to there yet, right? I don't know, I'm not saying we won't get there, but we're not there yet. But the other thing is, I have no faith in this road of scanning and repatriating. And one thing is, I think that once all the skeletal remains are repatriated, they will come after the casts because that's what they've been doing.
Right. If they
And I
want the
remember
x-rays, they're going to
they
want
want
the
the X-rays.
scans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do not think that that is the solution. I think the solution is to try to show people the value of the remains themselves and to to continue to speak up. It might not work, but it might, and it's definitely worth a shot.
Well, we don't really have any alternative. We have to take the shot.
Yes.
Um, so y- we've talked for a long time. I've enjoyed it, but we got to wrap it up. I wonder. You got some good news this week. Your university had initially moved for the courts to throw out your suit. You've now found that the court has decided the suit will go forward. So congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
What are the next steps? I mean, do you know when the hearing will be yet? Do you know, like, could you describe for us the most favorable outcome in your mind, or is it too early for that?
I think it's too early for that.
Okay.
I can and I don't know all the dates, but I think what I can say is that uh, regardless of the outcome, I'm very thankful to Pacific Legal Foundation for helping me. I also think that regardless of the outcome, my actions have brought attention to this very important topic, and it's not just about skeletal remains; it's about free speech and academic freedom. So even if you completely disagree with me on the bone aspect, I should still be allowed to talk about it, and I should not be punished for that. Um, the other thing is, I think that I feel like I'm always prepared for the worst, and I hope for the best. So regardless of what happens, I think I did the right thing.
I think you did the right thing too. And I also think I would say to anybody who's listening who's in a similar situation, I know there's a lot of academics that even a legal loss brings exposure to public exposure to the processes and the forces that are at work on campus now. And further, oftentimes in discovery, a lot of things come to light that the universities really didn't want to be public knowledge.
Absolutely.
And so it's even a legal loss does good work in advancing the cause here. Um,
Yes.
Elizabeth, I wish you the very best
Thank you.
in your fight, and I thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
It was fun. Maybe we'll have a follow up. Have a good day.